forgot I'm like 6'1". There you go. Can you hear me now? Okay. I'll be speaking on Hebrew Israelites, Black Hebrew Israelites. So, anybody familiar with them by any chance, or ever heard of them?
What did you say, black what?
Black Hebrewites. So, Black Hebrew Israelites. So, short term is BHI. So, yes, most people turn your heads. Most people don't really encounter them if you're a Caucasian. They typically avoid speaking to Caucasians. Um, their ideology is typically based on the Old Testament. So they are very hard when it comes to Old Testament teachings and following the Old Testament laws that are given to the Jews. When it comes to the Black Hebrew Israelites, their foundings and their first speaker, I believe, let me get to my notes, sorry. Open up Sesame, there we go. Their first speaker publicly was, there we go, was Frank S. Cherry and also William Saunders Crowndy. And this is back in 1847. That was their birthday. His birth and his death was in 1908. But this cult takes back all the way back then. It has its foundings, and say, for instance, their theological foundings are in Deuteronomy 28. When it talks about Israel, if you want to go there. So, 28. And so this is the blessing and the cursing when God was giving to Israel. When it comes to the Black Hebrew Israelites, I'll just read the entire chapter. And if you're, well, actually, no, I shouldn't read the entire chapter. I should just, it's a long one. Let me get to some of the key verses that they like to point out. So verse 41 is one of them. You shall father sons and daughters, but they shall not be yours, for they shall go into captivity. So when the Black Hebrew Israelites, their founding was their founding father when he first started preaching, who was a previously enslaved African American who believed that the blacks, after studying the Bible, were the true Israelites. They believed after the fall of the temple in 70 AD, the true Black Israelites fled into Western Africa, where later on they were captured by the white man. So I'm going to be using inferences when I'm speaking because they're very extremist. And that during that time period when Deuteronomy speaks about the Jews being exiled into captivity for 400 years or 500 years, they're saying this is a prophecy of the African Americans who were brought into slavery into the Americas. They start pushing more into the nationalism, so black nationalism. You'll usually find this in the Nation of Islam. So they have the same kind of ideology, not in the sense of Islam, more of the black part where they're pro-black. You know, they'll support BLM to the degree where they can get more followers intrusive into their doctrine or their set of beliefs. When you typically encounter them, you'll see maybe a group of like 5 or 6. You'll have one gentleman who's the speaker. Say, friends, he'll be yelling out, just saying some off the wall stuff. Let's just say that they're typically dressed up with purple. And you may see, if you are familiar with like YouTube shorts or Instagram shorts or Facebook shorts, you'll see a black guy speaking about, oh yeah, you know, we're the true Israelites, the Jews out in Israel. Those are not the real Jews. The black Jews are the real Jews. They need to be exterminated, taken away. They need to be destroyed. They'll interpret scripture in a way that paints African Americans as the sole arbiters of salvation, depending on which denomination of the cult. So there's a plethora of sub-denominations within the overarching denomination. So based on how a certain individual within their cult interprets the verse, that's how you'll have to talk to them, because within their own cults, they have, within their own cult and subcults, they have different interpretations of scripture and what is actually validated as Holy Scripture. So one set would say Torah only, where these are black Hebrew Israelites who only follow Torah, the first books of the Old Testament. And that's the only books they'll accept. Other sets will say, oh, we accept the entire Bible. So we accept the entire Bible. Other subsets will say, we accept the Bible and the Apocryphal literature, so typically the Catholic's Bible. Then you also have some that say we accept all the Bibles except Paul's writings. We do not accept Paul writings. One of the big reasons why they don't accept Paul writings, if you're familiar with Paul, he said there's no difference between Jew nor Greek. And that's one of their main arguments when it comes to that. With those who accept all Bibles, including Paul, they'll reinterpret that verse where it says it's not talking about those pagans. It's talking about the children of Israelites who were separated due to the judgment of God, when he destroyed the southern kingdom and dispersed them. Those are the particular ones he's talking about. And he's not talking about you guys. He's referencing to Caucasians. That's how they interpret that. They typically only follow the Old Testament commandments. So they believe when it comes to, say, for instance, Christ, the biggest parts of a lot of these cults, they'll demean Christ. So they don't believe Christ is actually God incarnate. They believe Jesus is just a man who was created. And there are two different interpretations. So you have ones who believe Jesus is a created man who followed the Old Testament law perfectly, and he came to set an example for those Jews that you can follow the Old Testament perfectly and you can inherit heaven by following the Old Testament commandments, abstaining from pork, and certain commandments. Now you'll bring up, say, for instance, okay, what about the sacrificial system? That's one of the biggest things. And like, well, we don't have to follow that. We don't have to follow the sacrifice because Christ is our sacrifice, because those fake Jews killed him. And so it all depends on what subculture. It's quite funny, but it depends on what subculture you're talking to. So when you're speaking to a Hebrew Israelite, you have to try to pinpoint what they believe in their own doctrine. And just know that they're highly racist. So you'll have a good national incident, whereas you remember in the news where there was a gentleman, I believe back 3 years ago, a college student, Caucasian kid, where an Indian guy was banging on a drum. It was all across the news. You guys are familiar with that. If you actually go watch the entire video, prior to that incident occurring, there were actually black Hebrew Israelites in the background yelling obscenities, saying you guys are products of incest, speaking to the Caucasian kid and the college students, and they're yelling this rhetoric. So they're getting all these things, say, for instance, from the Old Testament, where you have the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, what happened in the cave. They believe that these are, say, for instance, the seeds. These seeds are all Caucasian. And they'll pull stuff like that out, and it's based on their interpretations, particularly of Scripture again. So it's misinterpretation of Scripture every single time when you're dealing with them. You always have to say, they'll use Scripture as their final authority, but you have to be very, very strong in your Old Testament, especially when you confront them in regards to their camps. So that's what it's called. Their missionary field is a camp of about 5 or 6 guys. And so when they're bringing up the Old Testament, they'll pull the Old Testament and they'll talk to you about it. They'll avoid talking to Caucasians for obvious reasons, but they'll typically go towards Hispanics, blacks, they're considered 12 tribes. They actually have a note. So Judah is, say, for instance, African Americans, blacks. Benjamin is Western Indians, blacks. Levi is Hades or Haitians. Ephraim is Puerto Ricans. I won't give their names, but you have the Cubans, Dominicans, Guatemalans, and Mayans, Native Americans, which are Indians. Then you have Indians from India, then Colombians, Mexicans, and Argentinians, and these are considered the 12 official tribes of Israel, and they'll typically target people who are not very familiar with Scripture. So you can actually simply just Google search YouTube, say, for instance, a sermon by them, and you can hear the rhetoric, which is kind of insane. But they had their primary foundings. Let me go back to that. They had their primary foundings back in the 18th century, late 18th century. They moved from where is it at? Sorry, I had my notes. Scroll back up. There you go, Tennessee. They moved from Tennessee, had their first foundings in 1886. Started a church in Tennessee where they preached that Caucasians are inherently evil, they're sons of Satan. Then Jesus will return in the later century, year 2000, and he'll start a major race war between the false Jews and the whites, and the real Jews, who are the blacks and all the other minorities of the West. They started getting their big following, say for instance, towards the civil rights movement. We're all familiar with Martin Luther King. They'll interject in some of the movements and speak to African Americans like, do you know your true heritage? And most of those people are not really familiar with scripture, because typically in African American church, we're predominantly Pentecostal. We all know how Pentecostals are. We're all Reformed, so Pentecostals don't really have a strong grasp. A lot of them don't have a strong grasp on scripture, and especially in the Old Testament. So when they do their evangelism, they paint scripture in such a way that it makes them appear superior to all other races, and therefore you're saved not because of what Christ has done on the cross, but because of your nationality. Now, if you're familiar with the gospel, Jesus in John 8 had a conversation with Jews who fought against that. We're sons of who? Abraham. And he said, no, you're sons of your father, Satan, which the emphasis is on man's sin. They believe by following the Old Testament laws to a dot, a man can come to salvation and be saved, which we all know is not true. If you're trying to approach them with the gospel, I always say just go with the gospel and be able to preach the gospel from the Old Testament and also the New Testament, depending on what what subculture you're dealing with. You can find them on Facebook very easily. Just Google search, not Google search, Facebook search groups, Hebrew Israelites. There's about 6, last time I checked, if they haven't increased again. There's about 6 cults currently in Houston. One of them, subcults, are actually within the college campus, the African American College. I forgot the name of it. Texas Southern University. You have a subset in Texas Southern University due to the fact it's a predominantly African American school. So they'll typically preach about downtown. Is usually the first, second, and third ward. Usually preaching grounds for them because they're targeting the African American community and also Latin community. What are some good key factors when you're dealing with the Hebrew Israelites? They're very aggressive. So they will lay hands on you if it comes up to that point. I've tried to confront a couple Hebrew Israelites in front of my workplace at Costco off of Willowbrook Road. Got into a small altercation with them. Obviously, I didn't really fight back because the guy was puny, but sorry, but we sat up there arguing over scripture for about a good hour and a half. So he was a brand new convert to Hebrew Israelites. After we had our discussion, he walked away and tried to speak to some young African Americans walking up. I turned around and followed them, and it's like, well, this is not what that scripture. Let's read the entire context of that. What about when he was speaking to the woman in the well? What about this, and this? And they'll begin to get frustrated. So it's emotionally, it's majority of it is emotional. So they have their primary identity within their skin color, their outer. So if you're very familiar with BLM, Black Lives Matter, same exact ideology. It's pro black, 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 black all day. Latin culture. If you're white, they just hate you, which doesn't make sense, but they believe a Caucasian person some subcults or some sublets of the cult believe that Caucasians can be saved, but they will be saved to be slaves inside of heaven, which doesn't make sense, but yes, that's what some of the subcults believe in. When you can find videos of this online, they believe you can, say for instance, ask for forgiveness You, as the Caucasian, can ask for forgiveness to them by, say, for instance, doing acts of showing your submission and forgiveness by, say, for instance, kissing boots. So you'll actually see videos of this online. They'll have, I'm your master. So if I'm your master, kiss my boot. And they'll actually have, you'll see people actually do these things where men will actually start kissing the boots of the Hebrew Israelites and they'll praise her. See, she has accepted that she is a subservient to us. It's just literally just reverse racism. Another good thing to note about the Hebrew Israelites is they follow the Old Testament law in regards to even tithing. So kind of like, we have in Pentecostal churches, they believe in, we're going to pay our 10% to the church. This sometimes goes up to 20% based on the household. So this is how they get their funding within their ranks. 10% of the household is given, or 20% of your check is given to the cult. And this is how they uphold their institution. There's a major, what is it called? A major broad umbrella that they typically set churches up across the country. I'm trying to remember their name. I was trying to memorize all this stuff by heart, but yeah. You can find them on YouTube. A lot of the subcults will actually reject them due to their own personal extremist views. So you have some who go to the extreme left on one side and another part go to the extreme right. So we will reject you because you're not extremist enough in regards to these people can become saved. So you have that one party saying that and the other party say no, they cannot. Another good verse that they typically use to validate their insanity, they'll go to Revelations where it speaks about Jesus. He has feet of what? He's a black man. What color is his? He has hair that is what? Who has wool hair? What is this? And so if you're not familiar with scripture, obviously, these are points that they'll use to say, see, this is proof. Even Jesus is black. He's not talking to you. He's talking to us. Know your part. Know your place. It's literally just reverse racism. When you try to defend, say, for instance, Christ has come for all, they'll say, well, no, look what Jesus said. I've come for the lost sheep of. But if you don't read the entire gospel, what does he say later? They have rejected me, so I go to the. And so these are the key points that they'll typically jump to. This is some of the argumentation that I was dealing with when I was dealing with that young man. Again, these are just the black Hebrew Israelites. Whereas it's another good thing about them, all these notes. Where is it? One of their key phrases, they say white people and white Jews are commonly referred to as Edomites, descendants of Esau, enemies of Jacob. So what was Esau described as? Do black people have that? No, never. Well, my grandpa does, but this is what they'll say. You never see a black man with red hair, do you? No, never. There are black people with red hairs, by the way. But these are some of the definitive points that they'll use to justify their Old Testament beliefs. Some other stuff, their terminology when they're preaching, so you understand the context. When they're so-called is a term that they use in reference to the fake Jews. So they'll refer to them also when Paul is speaking about the synagogue of Satan. Those are reference to the white Jews in Israel. That's how they interpret that verse, which is crazy. What's another good one? They also have a very, I don't think I've already said, I know I've already said this, but they have a very negative view on the Jews, the true Jews, we know are the true Jews in the Middle East. They have a very negative view of them, so they actually hate them. They hate them to a passion, which most cults do naturally. Another point about them, when they were having their massive founding and their massive push after the civil rights movement, a group of them actually left and went into Israel. and they tried to start their own little establishment to bring the blacks back to the motherland. It failed, and so they began to negotiate with the Jewish residency. And this all stemmed prior, before they got to that point. They originally moved a lot of them to New York, where they tried to meet civil grounds with the Jews in New York, because Jews have a massive presence in New York. They tried to get a civil ground with them where we're the same brothers in faith. Obviously, this is before they pushed, they lowered down their extremist views to get a settlement so they can get flown back to Israel. Once they got to Israel, they did the exact same thing, try to bring more African Americans over into Israel to make their own establishment. It failed. After a couple years, they negotiated with the Israel government to have their own settlement placed in. Israel government actually eventually agreed to it. They agreed to it. They gave them their own settlement. There are right now roughly about 5,000 to 7,000 of them in Israel right now. And they turned around and started propagating their extremist views again. After they got their establishment, they ended up starting a school to educate those who are not aware of their true identity as Hebrew Israelites. Currently, with numbers, I can't really tell you how big they are because there's so many subsets. Say, for instance, at our brother Timmy's wedding, there was actually a Hebrew Israelite there as well. You wouldn't really notice him because but there's one there as well. And he was more of the friendly type, but he was whole hard gun hold for the Old Testament. You see him studying the Old Testament, the Old Levitical Law. Bible just lit up with highlight marks and misinterpretations of the Old Testament. Again, they followed the Old Testament to a T. When you evangelize them, just have your grounds in the Old Testament. You're able to preach the gospel from the Old Testament, knowing that Abraham wasn't saved by works, but he was saved by what? Faith. This was in the Old Testament. Be able to point those things out to them when you're talking to them. Again, depending on which branch you're speaking to, they always find their grounds in Deuteronomy 28. So all of them have in common is Deuteronomy 28. So if you're able to interpret Deuteronomy 28 as not a prophecy, but just what God was saying was going to happen to them, you'll be in good hands. Was anything else I'm missing? Guys, have any questions in regards to them?
Did I miss it, or did you say what their belief is in salvation?
In salvation, salvation by works. So they believe that they're saved if they follow the Old Testament to a T. So Jesus, when he came into the earth, he came as an example of a man can perfectly follow the Old Testament to a T. And that's what Jesus' resurrection, birth, and everything was meant to symbolize. So they misinterpreted, obviously, but that's what they believed. They believed that Jesus followed the Old Testament to a T, which is true. But he set that example that by doing so, you can go to heaven. So salvation by works.
Who do they say Jesus is?
Two interpretations for that. Some believe that he's incarnated God, but when he died on the cross, he only died for the blacks and Latinos and Indians, the minorities. And the other group believed that he was a created being. So there's like a two subset with that, where some have the same ideology as the Latter-day Saints. He's a created God. And others believe he's just a created perfect being, which is not God. So it's kind of hard to like pinpoint which, because the broad brand of subsets, but those are typically the three predominant beliefs that circulate within those camps.
Don't they like guns a lot?
Depending on which camp. So again, you have black nationalists, so they'll intertwine with that as well. So you can find black nationalists with guns who are also Hebrew Israelites.
So how do they feel about blacks with green eyes?
They're cool.
I mean, really?
Yeah.
I mean,
They're cool with it. They don't really care about like the eyes or anything. As long as you have black skin, you are a Jew. You are. Hold on, let me see what tribe you're part of. Like that. it makes no sense. But as long as you have black skin, now even when it comes to you being mixed, because how America is, if say for instance me and Medea, my kids are not considered mixed; they're considered black. Because even though Medea is Indian, our kids are considered black because black is considered dominant. So, say for instance, half and half, he's still black. He's black. He may be, say for instance, mixed with the infidels, or sorry, that's Islam speaking, but if he's mixed with the devil, he's still redeemable because he's black, and his blackness is going to over succeed that. He just has to reject his mother and family. It's nonsense.
So they're all about the Old Testament.
Yes.
So, and yet they pick and choose because they don't do the sacrificial stuff,
Correct.
which a lot of cults do that. But okay, so how far do they take this? Do we expect these people? Do they keep the Sabbath? Is there Sabbath?
Yes, Saturday.
Do they not work on that day?
Yes.
Are they very strict about that?
Yes. Some of them are very extremely strict on that. So kind of like we know in the New Testament, Jesus talks about how the Jews kept to, no working, don't do this. Some of them will go to that extremist where you can't do nothing. But it all depends on what set you're a part of. So, you go to one set, some of them will practice, say, for instance, some of the Pentecostal teachings of tongues where they just spazzing out on the floor. You go to another set where they'll say, we reject them because they're not following the true definition of tongues, which is languages. Well, yeah, I can agree with that, but your overall doctrine is wrong. But this is, again, it depends on what denomination or subset they're a part of.
I gotta tell you, Keith, I disagree with the term reverse racism. I think it's just flat racism. I think racism is the word that we need to use because it's just any race that dislikes anyone else. It's just flat racism, no
Yes,
matter how it goes.
I agree with you.
Yeah, I think, and the idea that a certain group can't be racist, because I've heard that. I've heard that, well, I can't be racist, I'm black.
Well, no, you can.
How-
You can 100% be.
That you don't like this other people group. What is that except racism that they don't see it?
Yeah, they can't even discern it. Like literally, when you have the story of Jonah, we all read Jonah. How Jonah is, he's the perfect example of how the Jews were. Like you can literally just you can paint that on them. Like, and they, in the workplace they'll remain quiet on how they believe because of the pay. But when you come into preaching and all that on the street, they'll be very vocal and aggressive with it.
Or do they go back to the marriage of Abraham and Keturah and Sheba, which was in Ethiopia? Do they even know that? No, I haven't studied it in depth.
Depend on what subset. So some of them, like the couple sets I've been studying and dealing with, some of them don't go as far as back as that. Because if you are very familiar with Old Testament and you just follow narrations, you'll actually see that they're actually some of the people that they were saying that can't be redeemed. God was actually redeeming them in the Old Testament, clear. But you'll have to bring it up to them in discussions. But a lot of the subsets I dealt with, I haven't seen them go as far as back as that. They'll start typically they'll go usually to the separation of Isaac and his brother. So that's where their starting point, because it's very primitive on the race part, even though the Bible doesn't actually tell you exactly what color they were. It just says hairy, and they just emphasize, well, this is mostly shown with them, so it's obviously them. So it's assumptions.
Well, it just takes a little study to know that those became the Arabs of today, not blacks. So,
Yeah.
but
Oh,
I don't think I have to say, I think this is pretty obvious, but they surely would not serve in the military in America.
surprisingly, one of their founders served in the military. In the 1800s, he served, I think, the northern. And afterwards, he started studying, what is it, Hebrew and Yiddish, I believe, which is it's like a slang of Hebrew.
So
Yiddish.
it's another group that enjoys the protection of the United States, but don't have anything to earn it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
You mentioned that some don't hold the Pauline epistles.
Yeah.
Is that because he's writing to Gentiles?
Yes.
Why do the other ones? Why do some reject the whole New Testament then?
Some of them don't. Some of them reject the whole New Testament. That I don't know why, to be honest. That subset I haven't really got that much into because only the ones I've dealt with usually deal with the entirety of the Bible or just the rejection of the Pauline epistles. So it's a little bit like a headache. It's a very massive headache to deal with them because it's just like you don't know who you talking to. Like only thing I can talk to, I'm like, okay, where we gonna start at? Well, I'm black, you're black. Okay, well, I guess we can start there. God has created all men with his devout image, including the white man. But
I was going to ask you because you hinted at a few places to go to. What are maybe two or three or four key passages or chapters that you would take into? And maybe it depends a little bit. Do they hold only to the old or to the new as well? But you mentioned John 4, the woman at the well.
John 4, the woman in the well, Christ speaking about going out to the Gentiles, the Pauline epistles, obviously, there's no difference between sorry,
And the woman at the well, you're thinking of
her being a Samaritan.
okay,
So she's a half breed.
yeah.
And so some will actually reject that, but a lot of them will affirm that, oh, since you're black and you're mixed, your blackness overwhelms the sin of your inherent Caucasianness, which, yeah. But you have that. Then another good passage is when Paul speaks about the grafting in Romans, grafting in of one. Obviously, he's talking about the grafting of the Gentiles and the Jews. Some of them will interpret that passage. So when you deal with them, they'll say, well, this is talking, the grafting in is talking about that, the dispersion of the Jews in the Old Testament. So they'll translate it, those are the Jews he's speaking about being drafted in, the Gentiles. But obviously you have to just go back not a couple chapters, but you go back into the Old Testament where, doggone it. Where is it?
Like Romans 11, where the Gentiles are grafted in.
Yeah, Romans 11, when Gentiles are grafting in, but you have to
People are Israel jealous.
make Israel jealous. So
Say it's Gentiles.
they'll insert the Gentiles as they are missing the destroyed southern kingdom. So they'll interpret that as the destroyed southern kingdom being regrafted in. So you'll have to show from the Old Testament that it's not talking about that, and that this is actually talking about the fulfillment of this. And so, again, it's all about interpreting the Bible the right way. So you have to understand what doctrinal points that they're coming from and misinterpreting and showing that what they're interpreting is wrong based on the rest of Scripture. But again, you have to know which subset you're talking to. So if you're dealing with the one who's willing to quote Romans, you're able to use the Pauline epistles and the rest of the New Testament. But when you're dealing with those who only accept, say, for instance, the Gospels and Acts, well, I have to show from here that he's talking, yes, these Gentiles he's speaking about are those who don't know nothing about Christ.
So maybe tracing some passages in the Old where the Gentiles are promised. Well, like you mentioned, Jonah at Syria,
Yeah.
where God is reaching out to the Gentiles, or the Jews are supposed to reach out to the Gentiles. Maybe that would be a set of passages you could go to, assuming they'll listen to you.
Yeah, assuming they listen to you, because a lot of times once you start getting to like deep theology, their frustration and anger will start to show, because again, they're extremists. So,
You gotta be discerning, be careful.
yeah, be careful. Use wisdom. Like I recommend use wisdom to a very broad extent. Use wisdom and make sure you're recording your conversation just in case something does happen. Oh,
Yeah, just what you just kind of said, Jason. You want to go as much as you can to the Old Testament for all of them, because they all accept the Old Testament as their baseline. So Isaiah talks about that and even all the way back to Abraham, right? In the seed of Abraham, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. So you have the entire nations of the earth are going to benefit and profit from the seed singular, which is the Christ to come, right? So, yeah, know your Old Testament prophets, especially Isaiah, because he's replete with hope for the Gentiles.
Yeah, they love Old Testament texts, but when you speak with them, that's exactly what they'll be quoting, a lot of Old Testament texts to prove their racism from that or to validate their viewpoint. They usually take it out of context, so just tell them to read the entire passage. They'll usually cherry pick passages. They'll take one passage, cherry pick, and go to another passage and make them sync up. And that's usually how they do it. That's coming from, say, friends, their training grounds. So a lot of them are ex-Pentecostals. Some of them they consider themselves old Baptists, but yeah, Baptists, Southern. Some of them are Catholics, the Latin community, but they'll typically target those who are not biblically informed, but who seek after it. A lot of those who are within the code who are African American typically don't have a father in their household. So it's kind of like gang culture. You look for acceptance and father mentorship, and you can find this within this cult. So those who are seeking, say, friendship, family, unity within a community, hey, buddy, they'll find that within their cult. A lot of cults are the exact same way. One of my favorite passages, Christ speaks about Luke 14:26. You must deny your mother, father, sister, brother, even your very own life tonight. So pick up your cross and follow me. It's making the division, the separation from those things. So I usually that's one of my key passages when I'm evangelizing Muslims and, say, friends, Hebrew Israelites or any type of cult. I usually love to quote that passage the most because it's cutting straight to the point. Some of them can identify what they believe in is wrong. They can come to the realization of, okay, this is wrong, but because I have all of this and I built so much of this within this, if I lose all of this, what do I get in return? Well, you get heaven, bro. What's more greater? And these are things that typically hold people back who are stuck in sight, friends, cults of any kind, even the Hebrew Israelites, Islam, Mormonism. A lot of them have a very strong, tight-knit community. And so these are things like when you evangelize anybody, you always have to keep in mind. The family plays a big role. Even those who are missing families cling to cults because it's somewhat replacing what they're missing out on or they perceive to be missing out on, not knowing that Christ offers all these things plus more. He's the father to the fatherless. So Christ can give them everything that they're asking for. They just have to deny themselves and pick up their cross and follow him according to what Scripture calls. Yes, sir.
Yeah, are there any local churches, or do they have churches?
Yes, they do have.
Are there any around here, or?
In this local area, no. You typically find them off of like 1960. They have last time I checked, they had two churches off of 1960. They have one in the third ward, third ward. But they're local, typically in African American dominated areas. So you won't typically find them on this side of town. If you do find one, it would be very rare. That's most likely for those dispersed children of Israel. But you'll find them predominantly in African American communities. That's their go-to. It's a headache.
Because there's so many subsets and some take these books and some reject those books, do they have their own version of the Bible, like the Mormon?
Oh, yes. They all adhere to one version of the Bible, which is the King James Version. They love the King James Version, that old English. They love it. They all accept the King James Version. That's their go-to scripture. That's all they use.
The cults really like the King James Version.
Yes.
The Mormons prefer the King James Version. When I was in the Self-Realization Fellowship by Paramahansa Yogananda, they sold the King James Bible in their bookstore. The cults love the King James.
Is the King James corrupt? Is it?
Is it because it's harder to understand?
Yes.
Or it's easier to
Cool.
misinterpret?
Yeah, Colts like to live in obscurity, right? So they love to obscure all things, and so right, they want probably the most difficult Bible for someone to handle. So that must be. I mean, that's what I would venture.
Yeah, it's most of.
So know the King James.
No, the King James. I know nothing about the King James.
When you pull out the King James and it's all highlighted, they freak out.
They will.
So should you utilize, or should you use the King James Version?
Yeah, just be familiar with the King James version. Some of them will actually try to quote the Hebrew.
With the phone now, of course, you can bring up the KJV version, so.
Yeah.
You know what you can get too is you can get like the parallel Bibles are so neat. You can get the King James and then like the ESV all in one book, and they just have the parallel verse by verse, like one on one side, one on the other side.
I believe you can do that with Logos, right?
I don't know.
Yes.
Is that a technology?
Yes, it's technology. Blue Letter Bible. Yes, they love the King James. So a lot of African Americans grew up with the King James version. Even nowadays, within my old church fellowship, that's what we used. We used the King James version, Prosperity Gospel, but everybody loves using the King James version. A lot of the Pentecostals will go to the newer version translation, which is directly for them, but a lot of those subcults will always go to the King James because it's hard to understand the Old English. If you're not familiar with thee, thou, thee, and them, and whatnot, and how it's meant to be interpreted, that's why they'll use it. And they'll preach to you from that as well. So say, for instance, in Deuteronomy, where it says they will be in bondage, it's not bondage. Sorry, the curse is in Deuteronomy 28, but there is a particular verse in there. Israel, captivity. When they translate captivity, they'll interpret that term captivity is talking about the captivity is them being transported back, being transported to the U.S. And so even if you try to go from a logical standpoint, saying, okay, the first slave ships came here way before the time period you believe in, they were enslaved for this time period, it won't even line up. So you can go around the logical route, just showing the fallacy in that. But a lot of them would be like, well, no, it's not talking about this. So the best thing you can do is just be very familiar with your Old Testament, because a lot of cults, logic goes out the window, but they'll hold hard to misinterpreting the Old Testament in the Bible.
I would just add, you can still quote the New Testament.
Oh, yeah, quote the New Testament.
Think about, all the religions and cults, even John 3:16, I mean, just.
God so
state
loved the
scripture,
world.
and just trust the Spirit to use that, even if they're wanting to reject the new.
There was actually a good testimony about a man who actually left Hebrew Israelites. He was talking to a evangelical pastor, and they were having an intense argument, and he couldn't defend his point of views. But he got angry, took off, but the scripture, and because he came to the knowledge, like he's interpreting correctly this and this, and it dwelt on his mind, and it festered. It took 10 years, but he said he couldn't get that out of his mind. Every time he came to that passage, the scripture, it just nicked at him. Then eventually he left. That happens a lot with people when it comes to cults and any form of religion. When the truth is given to somebody and it festers within them, it nicks at you. It always will nick at you. When the truth is given, it will nick at you and it will not stop. And it may seem like hard-hearted for some people from the outside appearance when you're having these arguments or debates, but when the truth is being given to somebody, just be truthful. Kind of like I said with Islam, give the truth, but give it with a soft tone. Be wary of how you're speaking to them. Don't demean them, but just give them the truth all the time from Scripture, and you will implant something within them. A seed, you don't know where it's going to go, but you'll give them something that they can dwell on for the rest of their life. Because that experience alone with the gospel being showcased in front of them by how you treat them and how you speak to them and giving them the truth in such a way that it will have an impressionable effect upon their life. And that gentleman's testimony was a good example of that. So you guys may not run into them due to the fact of their evangelizing tactics, But if you do see their camps on the side of the road, feel free, give them the truth in love and kindness. Any other questions? Yes, sir. No, they really don't. It's usually their elders. So kind of like how Catholicism is, the Pope can translate it any way or interpret it any way he wants. Mormonism, they can interpret it any way they want. Their leadership tells them what it really means. And so this interprets this, and it means this because this means this, and we're black. So how they reflect on Scripture is based on their nationality versus instead of how we interpret Scripture. We look at the Scripture and we defer what we are from Scripture. Vice versa, they will say, Scripture is my identity is telling me what I see in Scripture. So my blackness, I place it upon Scripture, and I find it all within Scripture. So it's kind of like they have a presupposition, and they'll go to the Bible to defend what they believe, instead of saying, the Bible tells me what I should believe. So again, you may run into somebody who will actually explain what they believe, but a lot of times the youth or the baby versions of the Hebrew Israelites don't really have a grasp of what they believe in. Those who typically are the ones speaking have a list of verses memorized in their personal interpretations or their certain set interpretations of those verses, and they'll spew them out, and the gentleman right beside them with the Bible open will read it verbally out. And then he'll say, this is it, and he'll interpret it from the gentleman reading it. And so usually when you confront them on the streets in these camps, that's what you'll be dealing with. And they typically make themselves appear as if they know they are. So, preaching, as they say, as they'll call preaching, is just the emotionalism and the yelling, and they try to be overbearing when they're speaking and talking to you. So by them doing this, he has, you look at him like, the guy must, he has to know what he's talking about. He's yelling like that. Very persuasive. It's like, this has to be the truth. And that's how, say, for instance, my culture will, we'll see that. We'll look at that like, and this guy over here is just talking to him gently, and I don't think he's sure about. But again, you still have to do what the Bible commands us to do. Be gentle, because the truth is going to always outshine the dark. Yes, ma'am.
So, you being black, if you approach them before you start witnessing, do they assume that you're...
I'm blind.
Huh?
They'll assume that I'm blind. So they'll when I come to approach, just look interesting. They'll first say, "Hey, brother, how you doing today, man?" Like, I'm doing good. It's like, so like, what are your beliefs? Like, what do you believe? And I was like, well, I believe in the Bible. I believe this is true. I go to church. I attend this church. I believe it to be. I'm an evangelical. I'm a born again Christian. Oh, really? Oh, really? Well, can you explain Deuteronomy 2:8 when it speaks about, say, for instance, our brothers are going to be in captivity, and if you look into the history of these things, and that's usually how they'll start. Like, you are a part of the tribe of Judah, brother. You are a king. You are this. You are that. And it's more of like they're trying to feed you, entice you into, oh wow, man, this sounds good. Like, I'm a king. Like, whoa. And it's an enticing thing. They're trying to entice you into their cult. And this is how they go about evangelizing African Americans and Latins. And then when you start saying, okay, wait, nah, man, that doesn't mean this or this, and that's when you'll start getting into the argumentation. And so you'll feel the tension in the room, let's just say that. Because I'll say, for instance, I'll be speaking to one gentleman from a camp, and one of their, I'll say, fondlings or fondles, so, one of the new guys, he'll be talking to me, and I'm like, well, man, what about this and this and this? And so the leader will take note of that, and he'll look at it, and he'll interject himself within the conversation. For some reason, I don't know, I feel like all cults do the exact same thing. Once they notice, like even with the Mormons, the Latter-day Saints, they'll have one person speak, then the senior will step in once he notices he can't handle it. Muslims do the exact same thing. Oh, hold on, let me they all do the exact same thing. I'm like, man, the devil literally just copies and pastes the same stuff all over the place. But that's how they usually work. It's it's crazy. Some of them actually, I believe, some subcults. I think there's like one cult. Some subcults actually practice multiple wives. So that's a part of. I don't think that's even derived from the Bible. I think that's just the black nationalism. There's a couple black nationalists who preach that men can have multiple wives because that's their inherent. Like men, they can't control themselves. They need to have multiple wives. Excuse to practice their lustful desires. So that's usually where you deal with. So just know you're literally just arguing with somebody who's a black national who uses the Bible to defend their racism. And you have to show that the Christ that they're painting is not the Christ of the Bible, but the Christ who came to save him who hates, to come into a relationship with the God who truly loves. Oh, it's time. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you so much. Yay, give it a applause.